Welcome to today's webinar, The Three Foundations of Workforce Wellbeing. Before we get started, I'm just going to go over a couple of items so that you know how you can participate in today's event. You have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane on the control panel. And you can send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect them and address them during the Q&A portion of our webinar. I will say this once or twice throughout the webinar, but I know we get lots of questions about it. We will have a recording of the webinar and a copy of the deck will be available after today's presentation, and it will be emailed to you in about 24 hours or within 24 hours, I should say. So just keep an eye out on your inbox. And now I am so excited to hand it off to our two presenters today, Carol Morrison from I4CP and Dr. Laura Hamill from Limeade. And Carol is going to be the one kicking us off today. So without further ado, Carol, I'm going to let you get us going.
Thank you, Carson. I really appreciate the invitation from Limeade to be here today to talk with everyone about workforce well-being. As you see on your screen, I am a senior research analyst with the Institute for Corporate Productivity. And for the last 15 plus years, I have had the privilege of exploring all kinds of key topics that drive excellence in both talent and business performance. And I'm here today because I most recently led I4CP's most recent study in workforce well-being. So I'm excited to share the findings from that study. Laura, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks. Thanks so much, Carol. It's so great to be here with you and to be doing this presentation with you, and it's great to be on this webinar. So I am the Chief People Officer and the Chief Science Officer at Limeade, and what that means with the Chief Science Officer piece is we do primary and secondary research studies on topics related to well-being, engagement, culture. And then having this second role, that part of my role, I actually have to put all the things we learn from the research into practice at Limeade. So I have kind of both of those perspectives of research and practice, and I'm just really excited to dig into this topic with Carol today.
Terrific, Laura. Thanks. It's great to be working with you today. This is just a quick overview of the topics that Laura and I are planning to cover with you today. And as Carson mentioned earlier, at the end of the presentation, we are planning a Q&A session. So please don't hesitate to enter any questions that you have in that question pane as we go through the presentation. So with that, let me introduce you just briefly to I4CP, the Institute for Corporate Productivity. We are a research organization that specializes in discovering the practices, the people practices or talent practices that drive high performance. And we actually define high performance on the basis of these four factors that you see here: revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer satisfaction. And we are looking at high performance companies that are able to sustain those top line business results over a period of time. So we are looking at those factors over a 5-year period in order to designate a company as a high performer. We do find that high performance organizations do things differently, and it is those differentiators that we are looking at in our research studies. Typically, we also find that the practices correlate strongly to better levels of market performance. The study that I am here to talk to you about today is one on which we collaborated with Limeade to get this research in front of broader audiences, and we really appreciate the role that they played in doing that. We also, as we do on numerous projects at I4CP, partnered with Rob Cross, who is a professor of global leadership at Babson College and writes extensively on matters related to collaboration in the business world, as well as more recently doing a lot of investigation into well-being in organizations. You'll notice that this research began with an online survey late last year, which is pre-pandemic, which is a hard time to remember now, I know, but we did find, despite the fact that we collected the data for this before the pandemic changed our lives, that the insights that came out of the data analysis are every bit as relevant now as they were then. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is in just a minute. We had, as you see, 557 respondents to this particular survey. These represented business leaders worldwide, global, multinational, and domestic organizations representing about 36 different industries, also representing commercial enterprises as well as nonprofit and governmental organizations. So a good distribution of perspectives here. As is the case with most of our I4CP research, we did interviews with well-being leaders. We like to get the perspective of people who are actually working in the field and have real-world responsibilities on the ground. So those augmented the quantitative data we got from the survey. And you can see from the cover of the published study that some of the leaders in the area of well-being, like Humana, Genentech, Nationwide Insurance, and Facebook, were among those organizations that with whom I was privileged to speak for this. So as you see from the title of this study, Next Practices in Holistic Well-Being, that begs the question, what the heck is a next practice? These are exclusive to I4CP, and they go beyond best practices. We define these as strategies that are done to a very limited extent by organizations overall. Typically, that's 20%, but most often it winds up being fewer than that. These next practices are strongly correlated to better market performance. And in the case of this particular research, we also included an index that let us identify companies reporting the highest levels of well-being among their employees. So the next practices that I'll be sharing with you over the next few slides also are strongly correlated to higher levels of workforce well-being. So we are looking at things that top companies are doing that enable them to have better outcomes, that are associated with better outcomes, not only in business, but also in well-being. So why are these next practices important? The reason is simply because they are in such limited use. And what that means to you is that if you take away one or two or three or more of these practices that we're going to talk about in just a second, and implement them in your organization, that gives you an opportunity to get a leg up. It enables you to be on the cutting edge of implementing these strategies in your own organization, and that can help you move the needle not only in business performance, but also in the performance of talent functions and other areas of your business. I want to start by sharing the definition of well-being that we used for this study. We're all familiar with the kind of traditional approach that companies have taken for years, showcasing benefits in physical health and in more recent years, mental health. But we really wanted to look beyond that because we started this research with a simple hypothesis, that being that these high-performance organizations that we look at would be much more likely to understand that they needed to take a holistic or whole person kind of approach to well-being. In other words, that these companies would be looking at all the different kinds of things that affect us as human beings and that affect our well-being. So to that end, we defined holistic well-being for this study with the 6 elements that you see on the right-hand side of your screen here. certainly including the physical and mental health elements that we're already used to, but also looking at financial well-being, which encompasses things like personal financial management. Do you know how to get a loan? Do you know how to get a mortgage if you need one? Are you saving money? Can you budget effectively? Those kinds of things. In social and relational well-being, we're looking at the relationships that affect us, certainly in the workplace with colleagues and managers and others, but also outside of work, our family, our friends, and others with whom we interact and have relationships. Career well-being deals with our level of satisfaction with the work that we do every day. Are we happy to go to work? Are we satisfied that we're being compensated fairly, that we have opportunities for career growth, for learning and development, those kinds of things. And finally, community well-being deals with our connections to the communities in which we work and live, and encompasses philanthropy and volunteer opportunities as well. Your company might call these considerations something different than what you see here, and in fact, a lot of research has been done in these different areas over the years. So regardless of what we call them, these are the elements that we've used to try and cover that whole spectrum of key things that affect human well-being. So I mentioned that we started this research with the idea that we'd find that these high-performance companies that we look at would be much more likely to take a holistic view and be working in the different elements that affect their employees' lives and well-being. And in fact, that's exactly what we did find. 86% of large organizations overall told us in the survey that they have some kind of well-being program in place, and it could be one, maybe more of these elements. But those high-performance companies we found are far more likely to emphasize all 6 elements of well-being. And that whole person approach did prove to be strongly correlated to both better market performance and higher levels of workforce well-being. On the right-hand side of your screen here, the blue bars represent high-performance organizations, and the gray lower performing companies. And these, what I call X factors that you see here, point out the gaps in between those two different kinds of organizations in their emphasis on these different elements of workforce well-being. And you can see that even in the more traditional physical and mental health areas, there's a noticeable gap. But as you go down to these other elements of well-being, you see that those gaps really begin to increase and really mark high-performance companies as standouts in being more focused on all of these areas. That said, I do want to note that there is still plenty of room for all organizations to improve significantly in their focus on this whole person approach to well-being. Even though high performers are in the 60% plus range in most of these areas, that still leaves a significant amount of room for even the top companies to improve at doing this. Yeah, I told you earlier that we found that the insights that we gained from this research continued to be really relevant and sort of spot on post-pandemic, even though the data was gathered before COVID-19 came on the scene. The reason for that is we found that the best outcomes and well-being hinge on sort of setting the context, if you will, for well-being. And we found that there were 3 specific pillars that made up the foundation of well-being, and that's culture, leadership, and relationships. In the area of culture, we found in particular that a purpose-driven culture that centers on well-being pretty much helps to gather everyone around that idea, and it helps to focus functions and activities within the organization in support of that culture. And one of the things that is apparent in this well-being research, as is the same case in other aspects of business performance, and it's this, that organizations, in order to succeed in whatever imperative they're looking at, need to make sure that their operations, their processes, their procedures, their programs, et cetera, all are aligned with helping to drive success in that area. And this slide presents some of the next practices that those high-performing companies are using to align their talent programs in particular to help support a culture of well-being. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into all of these at the moment. I can, again, respond if you have questions about specific ones at the end of the presentation, but I do want to call out just a couple of these. In designing learning content to improve knowledge of well-being is something that, again, this X factor shows that top companies are doing twice as much as lower performers. This also highlights the fact that your learning and development function has a lot of opportunities, and this is one of them, in helping to support and drive success with workplace well-being. And this is a simple matter of designing learning content so that it helps to educate employees, managers, and others about the different aspects of well-being, helps them learn how what the levers are that they can pull to positively affect their own well-being, and so forth. In the area of total rewards, this is a double-edged benefit with this particular next practice. Using recognition programs to spotlight employees who have achieved special things in well-being. Maybe you had somebody run a marathon, or perhaps somebody paid off a giant student loan, or maybe somebody was designated volunteer of the year in their community. But whatever it might be, any achievements in the area of well-being that are spotlighted not only reinforce the efforts of those employees that were involved in those achievements, as well as their peers, but they also help to showcase and increase visibility about the well-being benefits and initiatives that your company offers. And since we found in our research that participation rates are a big stumbling block for a lot of companies, and lack of awareness about the benefits that companies offer is problematic. This enables you to address those kinds of concerns. And as you see, those market-leading companies are doing this 5 times more than lower performers. The last one I want to call out on this page is the performance management piece, which you see top companies do at a whopping 10 times the rate of lower performers. And this is simply including discussion about well-being issues in the regular performance conversations that are going on between your managers and their reports. This establishes also a regular cadence for talking about well-being, which over the long run reiterates your organization's commitment to that and helps to identify not only issues but opportunities that can be leveraged in the area of well-being. Our second piece here on leadership found that the roles of leaders are important in well-being, and they can be both negative and positive. In 3 in 10 organizations, we found that top stumbling blocks to effectiveness in well-being programming centers on the fact that leaders don't understand the business case for well-being programs. They don't buy into the value that a commitment to employee well-being can offer the organization, and that leaders' behaviors don't necessarily support workplace well-being. This leadership piece was one that was of particular interest to Rob Cross, our partner in this research, and he identified some of the specific behaviors, the positive behaviors that leaders can implement to have an effect in some of the different areas of well-being. And what's neat to me about these particular behaviors is that you don't have to be an executive leader in order to participate in this and to have a really active role in positively moving the needle on well-being. Some examples of these behaviors in the area of physical well-being: just encouraging employees' good health habits. This is something that can be done effectively through just informal conversations between leaders as they might be walking through a department and run into an employee and have just a quick informal conversation about good health or well-being kinds of habits. In the area of mental health, this is something that leaders at all levels can do, but buffering people from unreasonable work demands and helping ensure that they're not under undue pressure to try to do too much or too fast or whatever the case may be. This is something that certainly leaders from the front line up can reasonably do. In career well-being, structuring work so that it aligns with your employees' career goals. This is ideal for frontline leaders who typically have a pretty intimate knowledge of their reports' career goals and career paths that might be open to them. So encouraging them to design work or funnel projects to those employees that will help them build the skills and experience they need to achieve their career goals is a great and positive behavior in support of well-being. Community well-being, encouragement to participate in volunteer activities, which many companies do, is a great way for leaders to support well-being objectives. And finally, in the area of social well-being, this is all about helping to create circumstances that strengthen relationships within the organization, encouraging collaboration to co-create solutions to work problems or work projects. And rather than vesting responsibility for projects in a single team leader, working to diffuse that across the team members so that that whole collective and collaborative approach is strengthened. Finally, in the area of workplace relationships, these are some of the next practices that we found high-performance companies doing, as you see by the X factors, pretty significantly more often than lower performers again. A couple of things in these top companies, internal social networks provide a really great way for employees to establish and lead online communities around certain aspects of well-being. And that could be anything from getting outside and walking to Zumba classes to financial management to great volunteer opportunities, etc. And I especially want to call your attention on this slide to the last one. That's leveraging well-being champions, which you see those top companies do at more than 4.5 times the rate of lower performers. This just involves recruiting employees across your organization, people who have an interest in some aspect of well-being and are willing to interact with their colleagues, to encourage them, to provide more information about different aspects of well-being. These advocates can also serve as liaisons between the company and employees to reinforce communications about the availability of benefits and programs and so forth. So this is something that really is being done, strangely, by fewer than about 10% of companies overall, which was a surprising statistic to me, but it is very effective, highly correlated to, again, both market performance and workplace well-being. So at this stage, I want to pass the baton to Laura and let her speak with you about well-being from the Limeade perspective. Laura?
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much, Carol. I love this research so much, and I love the X factors. So thanks for sharing that with us. So for those of you who don't know, yeah, for sure. For those of you who don't know, Limeade is an employee experience software company, and well-being is at our core. It's really where we started. It's what we truly believe is what can differentiate organizations, is caring about people as human beings. And I think Carol just showed us that data, right? That it does absolutely differentiate high performing from not high performing organizations. So what I'm going to share with you are some of our research on this topic, and what you'll see, I think, is there's so many similarities to what Carol has found in her research. So if we could just go to the next slide. A little bit of context for you is one of the teams that I am responsible for is Limeade Institute. And it's an internal team at Limeade, a team of organizational psychologists. And we do research studies, primary research studies where we do the actual research, but also secondary research where we just go learn from good existing more academic research and really bring that forward. So we talk about, we really focus on things like well-being and culture and inclusion and engagement, really those areas that are the most important to creating a great place to work. So if you would just go to the next slide, there's a really fundamental concept here. And it's this idea of surrounding and supporting employees as human beings. So kind of at the core of what we focus on is, how you can really care and support the whole person, that you value them as whole people. And then the next layer of that is, how do you authentically and really consistently, as a whole company really, show that care and support? And then finally, the ecosystem. What are all the resources, the capabilities, the partners that are all helping you do that as well? So it's really this kind of build of whole person, whole company, whole ecosystem. That's how you authentically can show your employees that you care about them. So really, well-being, from our perspective, well-being is not just about a set of benefits. It's really, do you truly and authentically care about your employees as human beings? It's not just enough to have a bunch of great resources. I think that's the real evolution and the real learning. It's not enough just to say we even have a program. It's, what do we do with those resources? What do we do with that program to have it be part of our culture, to have it be authentic, to have our employees really feel at a deep level that we care about them? So if you would just go to the next slide, Carol. So we really believe, and I think the research supports it, that it's the right thing to do, to care about your employees as human beings. But it's also good for your business too. And that's what I love so much about Carol's research, right? She just kind of showed that over and over again. These high-performing organizations are doing these things. And we have an approach, we just call it the Limeade results model. And it's just this idea that you get better people and business results when the company actively shows that they care for their employees and allow those employees to care for themselves and to care back, right? To really create that mutual commitment. So what we very much are always looking at is, how does care, how does well-being, how does that combination impact things like turnover, employee engagement, overall perceptions of well-being, those kinds of people results, and then profit, customer satisfaction, the ability to be more innovative. So I think it's really important for us to all really understand that this does lead to better people and business results. It's not something that's soft. It's not something that should be kind of put over in a little corner that just sits in benefits. It really needs to be something that is a whole company experience. So we just go to the next slide. So, oops, sorry that slide doesn't have an O. It's supposed to say organizational support. So apologies for that. So what I think you might see here is something interesting, right? This very much aligns with Carol's 3 foundations of culture, leadership, and relationships. This is some research we did based on academic literature on organizational support theory. And basically what we did is to find 8 different levers that organizations can really pull if they want to really truly support well-being. And what we found is all 8 of these were statistically related to overall perceptions of organizational support. They also were statistically related to overall well-being. So again, that idea of well-being and care sort of the short version of organizational support, the easy word, not as much of a mouthful. So when you have well-being, you also need to have this organizational support or care in place. So one just little add to this, we did some research and put all 8 of these different levers into a statistical model with some of the research we were doing, because we wanted to see which of these were the most important in terms of overall perceptions of organizational support. And what we found in our research is that manager was the most important lever. We really believe that culture impacts all of these things, but in this research that we found, manager played a huge role, which I think from a practical perspective, we can probably all see, right? How our manager talks to us about our, what's going on in our lives, whether or not you feel like your manager really cares about you as a human being is just huge, right? It is your day-to-day experience. So this model is something that we use kind of at the foundation of Limeade, and again, it very much aligns with Carol's work as well. So if you could go to the next slide. I mentioned before that a lot of the work we do in Limeade Institute absolutely comes or starts from more academic literature. And so this is a meta-analysis, and I am a huge sucker for a great meta-analysis. This one just got me really geeking out. So this meta-analysis had, I believe, 581 studies in it. So if you're not familiar with a meta-analysis is a study of studies, right? So think about each one of those 581 studies had its own set of participants. So what is great about a meta-analysis is you can feel pretty confident about the results because it's showing consistency across many research studies. So what you can see here is that organizational support is related to a lot of good things that we want for our organizations, right? So lots of outcomes that most of us are really striving for, like increased trust, more commitment, higher levels of performance, more likely to stay in an organization. So there's a lot here that's related to things that we care about. So I think that is pretty darn compelling that we should be focusing more on this idea of organizational support. And you think about it, it's not rocket science, right? It really is this concept of how do we support and care and really show our employees that they matter to us. And I think what's so fascinating is that a lot of organizations still aren't doing this. In fact, I continue to be surprised about, or I hear stories from employees, I hear stories from HR people saying, gosh, our leaders just don't understand this. They don't connect with this. And I think a lot of that is about their own experiences as employees, right? That there's such a history of work being about command and control, about work not being a place where you can feel that emotional connection. I mean, even thinking about the words that we use in organizations, like saying something like the word care, you sort of get people like, oh, is that a word we should even be using? And what I'm really excited about is just seeing an evolution in this. In fact, I was just on a call with a group of CHROs who were all saying that is what we've, kind of with the hard lesson of COVID-19, of the coronavirus, is we are learning and having this kind of forced experiment right now about trust and about care and about prioritizing human beings like we've never had before. So really, I feel like the research is so strong with this idea of organizational support that it really is what matters. So it's related to things we want, but if you would, Carol, go to the next slide. Organizational support is also related to lowered stress, lower burnout, turnover. Really, like, it not only creates a lot of good things, but it reduces a lot of bad things. So again, such consistent results in terms of, you know, organizational support being something that truly matters. So if you would go to the next slide, this is a little snippet of some of the research we've done in the Institute that is very related to what I was just talking about. So this is a study we conducted last year, and we found that when participants said that their organization does care about them, so those are the participants on the right-hand side, when their organization does care for them, they were 60% favorable on intent to stay 3 or more years, compared to the group that said their organization does not care about them, which was 7% favorable. And then the same idea, likelihood to recommend your company as a great place to work. When employees felt like their organization did care about them, they were 91% favorable on that compared to 9%. So there's an X factor for you, a 10X, right? A 10X factor of likelihood to recommend your company as a great place to work when employees feel like their organization cares about them. So this idea of care and organizational support and the three foundations that Carol has really pointed out is really, really an important construct. So I think, back to the point of what's happening in the world right now, there's so many things that are so challenging about it, and people are, I think, more stressed than they've ever been. There continues to be every day another challenge, another stressor. And to me, it's just never been more obvious that we truly need to care about our employees as human beings and really about all aspects of their well-being. So I hope that you see some real consistencies here in the research between what we are doing in the Institute at Limeade and then at I4CP. There's some really, I think, strong and encouraging messages. So Carol, if you would just go to the next slide.
Yeah, these are some of the key takeaways. That was a great presentation, Laura. It's amazing to me how beautifully the research I4CP has done and the research from Limeade just fit together and complement one another.
Yes.
So in terms of key takeaways today, again, you will be able to access the recording and the deck from this presentation so that you will have all of those next practices that I shared earlier. But in just a few words of advice, if you haven't already evaluated your organization's definition or perspective on well-being, and many companies are doing that, being motivated by COVID-19 to do it, it's an ideal time to look at that. And because of the economic fallout of this pandemic, that whole financial piece of the well-being puzzle has been particularly important. And really all of those elements, we've certainly seen that the social and relationships that we have that sort of help to sustain us, that's really become a lot more obvious in many contexts, because we don't just have somebody sitting next to us that we can turn and talk to in the workplace. So it's a great time to look at how you define well-being, and if you have opportunities to bump up your emphasis in any of those 6 areas. Assessing your organizational culture is important too, and certainly Laura spoke to that whole idea again of creating the right environment for well-being to thrive. And a big piece of that is organizational culture, and just making sure. Also, Laura, I was really excited to see that you had called out strategic alignment, because again, that is such a big piece of successfully moving the needle in the area of a purpose-driven culture that supports workforce well-being. Take a look at the alignment of your processes, your procedures, your different programs across your organization, and make sure you're not just giving lip service to a commitment to well-being and then maybe asking people to be available by email 24/7. You know, you need to, it's a great time to root out those kinds of inconsistencies. And finally, and I believe my colleague Stephanie Werner from I4CP, and I appreciate it, included this link in the chat section today, and we invite you to download free the Next Practices in Holistic Wellbeing study from I4CP, and in that you will find a number of examples of how those participating organizations like Humana and Nationwide and Facebook are taking well-being to heart in the kinds of next practices that they're putting into place, provide great illustrations for following in your own company. Laura, you want to talk about these other ways?
Yeah, thanks, Carol. So I guess one of the biggest takeaways here, I think, is if your organization really wants to improve well-being, you have to actively support it. Again, I can't emphasize it enough. It's not enough to just say, oh yeah, we've got this program over here, go do that, go fix yourself, employees. It's just not going to work. You have to actively support it. You have to determine how you're going to authentically dig in and do the hard work to support the well-being of your employees. So that's, I think, the biggest kind of message here. And there's just real work behind that, right? It's not, again, just a matter of checking some boxes. You have to dig in and do the work. And I think that it's been so neat to see that organizations are really realizing this, that when they authentically care about their employees, it's just better, right? It's better for employees and it's better for the organization. And that authenticity is really, what's so important here. And again, I keep kind of bringing this point up, but I think what's happened with coronavirus has really helped us see what's important and what matters. And it's about human beings and it's about relationships. And I think that we've kind of been forced, but I hope we've learned, some really important silver linings in this about humanity, right, in this whole thing. So I wanted to just reiterate a point Carol made about thinking about your definition of well-being. I think this is another area that the well-being industry has really evolved over time. I've been lucky enough to be one of the co-founders of Limeade, and so I've been in this area for over 14 years now. And so it's been fascinating to see how it has really changed over time, and it absolutely is so much more than physical health. And in fact, those 6 areas, I love those 6 areas that Carol pointed out. We really think about like an overarching definition of feeling good and living with purpose. And the feeling good piece is about, feeling good in your body for sure, but a lot about it is feeling good in your head and how we think every day. Really, the idea of positive psychology and how we have the opportunity to really change how we think about our circumstances in our life every day. And then that idea of living with purpose, right? We all need to have a reason why we want to wake up every day. So that is so different from where we started in this whole industry, which was, hey, stop smoking, or hey, lose weight. I just love that evolution of where we are now, that it's really about valuing human beings. So just wanted to add that into your point, Carol, about the definition of well-being.
Yeah, I think those are excellent points, Laura, and you really brought out an idea that we have seen play out in this research and in more recent well-being research that we're going to be publishing later this month, and that is the huge jump in interest in mental health. Certainly, we could all use a big cup of mental health, given the chaos that our world has become since the onset of the pandemic, and issues with social injustice and so forth. But we found in our initial research that high-performing companies were far more likely to emphasize mental health and to say that they were pretty effective at helping support better mental health for their employees. But but we're seeing even more signs of greater growth, certainly in mental health, in the other areas of well-being also. So you're spot on when you talk about the expanding definition there.
And there's so many layers to that, right, Carol? I mean, the mental health, it's one thing to be supportive of people who are going through some, like a mental health crisis, and to have amazing resources for that. It's a whole other thing to be thinking about, wait a second, how am I as a manager, or how am I as a leader causing serious stress to my employees in the day-to-day work, right? And so that really spans such a big, broad array of behaviors and ways that, organizations can actually do something to address emotional well-being and mental health. So there's just so many layers to it, right?
You're absolutely right. One of the conversations that I had with a well-being leader at Nationwide for our research emphasized what they term mental health for the mentally healthy. And the really neat idea that she expressed was that, we all know if we're gaining a few pounds, if we need to go on a diet, we know how to recognize that as human beings. But we're not taught how to recognize what is and isn't, what's good mental health, what are warning signs that maybe things are slipping a little. We don't know what that continuum is as reliably as we know other areas. So they're working to educate people about what good mental health looks like and how to recognize signs that maybe I need to talk to somebody, or maybe I need to really get involved and get some telecounseling, whatever the case may be. So that's a really great takeaway that came out from that discussion that echoes what you're just saying.
Yeah, oh, that's fascinating. I love that so much. I think even the way the topic of burnout has become more common in organizations, right? Just understanding, what are those precursors to burnout? What are the things that I should be paying attention to? And for us to take something that used to be only just barely in maybe for physicians or, healthcare workers, now to really think about how does that idea really apply to all of our work, and what are those signs, precursors, like you said, to burnout. So yeah, it's really, I think, encouraging to see how it's evolved.
Exactly.
One of the things, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead, Laura.
Okay. So one of the things that Carol and I have just, sort of been geeking out about before this, webinar and during, I hope you see, is that there is such a consistency, right? And this idea of, caring about people as whole people, really supporting them. And so the research is so consistent. The research is really strong, right? You take the research, the X factors that Carol was talking about, you take the meta-analysis work that I was talking about, the care work we've done in the Institute. It's pretty consistent. But there still is really, a big practice gap, meaning I hear all the time of organizations who just aren't doing this. I hear regularly. I recently was working with a company. I was doing a presentation on burnout. And my big kind of main point with burnout is the care piece, right? Like that the organization plays a role in causing burnout. And I was so distressed that they said, could you take out those slides that talk about, the organization's role in burnout? Just take those slides out because we don't want to talk about that. And I'm like, what? That is the whole point, right? I mean, you can't take that out. Luckily, they finally agreed, but I was just disturbed, right? That a lot of organizations aren't really willing to own up to their role or their responsibilities. And so it's just such a bummer, right? And so I don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Carolyn. Why do you think there's such a practice gap?
Yeah, I think that whole authenticity piece that you've stressed comes into play here. And one of the things that I4CP does in our research is ask about the effectiveness levels of what people are doing, and ask specifically what are the stumbling blocks that are holding you back. And as you might imagine, obviously cost is the perennial hobgoblin for any business initiative. And that certainly is apparent. We don't have to look any further than getting medical care these days to see how expensive benefits and purchasing different things like that can be. But so cost is a factor, I think. As I mentioned earlier, failure of leaders to really either grasp or buy into the business case. We see that there's a business case. Our data tells us that over and over and over again, but it's either not getting presented well, or or leaders are simply not buying into it. But the other thing is, and I think this is really a big problem for, actually it was a problem for more than half of the companies that we talked to, and that is that they don't know how to measure the results of wellness and well-being programs effectively and link those business results.
Yeah.
Do you find that?
Yeah, completely. And I think that's one of the things I was trying to kind of show in that Limeade results model, is that there are lots of outside academic research studies that show the statistical connections between these constructs, these concepts of well-being and care, and people results, like increased levels of engagement, and business results too, right? But people want to see it for their own organizations. And so that's what I think is really hard sometimes, is to be able to get that data, show that data, make those statistical connections, and show those research studies, because I think when you do, you really can see those results. We've been lucky to see those results with our customers. It takes some time though too, right? It's not, hey, we instituted it this last quarter and look at how everything's better. It is because it's such a organization-wide and a culture change. It takes some time for it to really have an impact. So I'm with you. Those three areas I think are so important: the cost leaders and business results. I just wanted to play on that leaders piece. And I think I might have mentioned this before, but I think that's one of the biggest barriers is a lot, and we all know this, but a lot of people who are in positions of power tend to be a little bit older, like me, maybe, and we didn't really have great role models or examples of being cared for or being thought of as a human being, honestly. And so we just don't know how that works, right? We didn't see that work. I had a really interesting example. I was doing a presentation for a group of leaders, and I had a COO of a large hospital system sitting next to me, and I did my presentation. It was about the science of care. I did my presentation. I sat back down, and he said, "That was so good, and I completely get intellectually what you're saying, but I just don't understand. I've never experienced that before." And it just made me go, wow, this is one of the real true barriers we have in making this become true practice, is that people who are in positions of power don't really get this. They don't really, and I'm generalizing like crazy, but they don't connect with it as much as maybe people who are younger, or maybe people who've been through really important life experiences and have come to understand, that this is really important. So I'm with you. I do have hope though, because I do see many organizations, especially, I think this, again, the coronavirus thing has really opened people's eyes to some of these concepts.
Absolutely, Laura. Totally. To your point, the pandemic has really accelerated, I think, the direction in which companies were sort of slowly moving, and has really sped up that process. But to your point about leadership, one of the things that was most encouraging to me coming out of our research is that companies like Humana and Nationwide and Genentech and others are making it a point to include well-being in leadership development. Mm-hmm. They are adding specific classes, if not entire courses, over time, in educating leaders at various levels through their development about the importance of well-being, about its place in relation to the organization and how it drives better performance, better engagement, reduces turnover, et cetera. But they also are teaching and redefining their expectations in leadership behaviors. And they're altering their leadership behavior models in some cases to, they're teaching leaders how to have those conversations about, what if you notice that you have a report who's you think maybe having some emotional issues. That can be an uncomfortable area for people to talk about. So they are, in some cases, even providing short scripts to help leaders learn how to broach those subjects and giving them strategies to refer people to their EAP programs or whatever other actions, connect them with telecounseling or whatever the case may be. And so they're educating them in the different areas, not only with mental health, but the other elements of well-being too, which I think is really encouraging and probably, hopefully, bodes well for our leaders in the future.
Completely. That is so encouraging. And it's, I mean, the fact that we have to have scripts and be very kind of behaviorally, coaching people how to do this, right, just shows that there's a lot of work we have to do, right, to be able to help people get there. But I think you're right. That's a great news. That's really encouraging.
Well, we still, probably you know this better than I do with your background in psych, that we're still dealing with that stigma about admitting to having mental health issues and then pursuing treatment for them. So I'm glad to see companies addressing that as well.
Me too. It's huge. It's so important. It is a big, big evolution for sure. Mm-hmm. So I think we only have a couple more minutes. I wonder if we maybe just end on this idea, maybe the last kind of concept, Carol, around how do we get maybe boards to start thinking about some of these kinds of things? And maybe it's a little broader even than well-being, but I think it's the idea of culture. And, I think it's fascinating how boards are structured and what boards focus on. But I think that there's a real opportunity for boards to start caring more about culture. I feel like a lot of the focus is on compensation, executive compensation, and to see, wait, what if boards actually were asking more questions about culture, more questions about the health of the organization overall? What would that be another way to influence some of these things? And I was really encouraged. I saw this report from the National Association of Corporate Directors, which was about, the role of culture in the future. And it's like, yes, this is maybe starting to happen. But I think to me, that might be another way for this to start becoming a priority in organizations. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Absolutely, yeah, and we saw that report as well, and I would concur. What I also see happening that is really cool is, one of I4CP's founders, Jay Jamrog, has said 10,000 times, if he said once, that what gets measured gets done and or gets noticed. And that's what I'm seeing. Humana, for instance, and some other I4CP member companies that I've spoken with recently are now doing well-being dashboards. And those dashboards typically are capturing something in the neighborhood of 60 to 70 different metrics, from business metrics as well as metrics that pertain directly to well-being. And those are being elevated in many instances to the board level, or being at least reported on to the board. So I'm seeing those kinds of bubble up in organizations, which I think will ultimately help drive that outcome that you're talking about here.
That's awesome. That is really cool. Well, Carol, it's been so fun talking with you. I guess we should hand it back over to Carson, perhaps.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. This has been such a fun and engaging part of the webinar. I love just having this conversation. And I would love to squeeze in at least one question in our last minute, if that's okay. I'm going to tee this up. And this is coming in from Todd Allen. And Todd asked, has Limeade or I4CP conducted any research to see if there's a correlation between organizations that support diversity and inclusion programs and higher levels of well-being? So I would love to hear a really quick synopsis from both of our speakers today. So Carol, why don't you kick us off, and then Laura, why don't you wrap us up?
We actually do have an element on that in the research that we're about to publish. It should be out in the next couple of weeks. I've pulled up on the screen here our email addresses, and if you want to email me, I will make sure that you get some follow-up information on that. We definitely did find some close linkages between well-being and D&I in organizations.
Us too, same thing. We found that we did a study last year, I believe, that showed there is a statistical relationship between well-being and perceptions of inclusion. And it makes sense, right? Like, how do you feel? How could you have like a high quality of life? How could you feel good and live with purpose if you don't feel like your voice matters, if you don't feel like you're valued for who you are? So it is a really integral component of this, for sure.
Exactly. Thank you. Great question.
Yeah.
That was a great question. And that brings us to the top of the hour. That time flew by, but I want to thank everyone who was with us today. To the audience, thank you for being a part of this webinar, and especially to Carol, the team at I4CP, and Laura. We learned so much. I really appreciate your time, and hopefully we can all gather again to talk about the state of things in maybe a couple of weeks or a couple of months. But until then, I wish everyone a great day and a healthy week as well.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.